Day after yesterday, April doesn't feel quite so live. Probability is less than 10% that they'll adjust rates again then. Yellen obviously cited international factors, weakness in China, some of the financial instability as sources of her concern and reasons to be cautious. She was also, I think, somewhat surprisingly dismissive of the uptick that we've seen in inflation, which has been fairly broad-based amongst the core constituents of either CPI or PCE, suggesting that we'll still be at or below the Fed's target for considerably longer. It's not a view that's shared by everyone, and that's probably one of those battle lines, I would say.
To what extent does this seem opportunistic, though, to point to China as a reason perhaps to push back expectations of a hike here? As we know, this Fed under Janet Yellen has not as actively talked about the international scene as it's discussed monetary policy for the United States. So why now?
Well, I think opportunistic is perhaps a bit strong. In other words, I think Yellen and probably the core members of the FOMC do view the international environment as somewhat precarious, as somewhat fragile, and from that perspective, certainly something that they'll take into consideration. But as I said before, they don't yet seem to be persuaded about that second pillar of monetary policy, namely inflation.
We've had three so far that have spoken about the potential for an April hike. James Bullard, who has had a lot of credibility around the rate hike cycle in the States, Dennis Lockhart, John Williams. So there are agitators on the board at the FOMC. So does that mean June has to unlock a rate hike if we stay on this path with the data coming through showing some strength in inflation?
Well, I think all three of the gentlemen that you just mentioned, but for that matter also Janet Yellen, they're all flexible people. They're all going to be data dependent, to use a sort of a Fed terminology there. And I think ultimately the data on growth, both at home and abroad, and on inflation will guide them. One thing that we haven't really talked about that she did mention in her press conference following the last FOMC meeting is slack in the labor market. And the rise in the participation rate that is now beginning to unfold is something that bears watching, because if there is more slack, it might even take June off the table as a so-called live meeting.